The millionaire scoffed, "You think you're smart? Translate it." The phrase was in Croatian and everyone laughed at the humble young woman. But when she read it aloud without hesitation, the hall froze. His smile disappeared, and her secret became the biggest revelation. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you are watching us. We continue. The gentle breeze from the coast of São Paulo blew through the large windows of the mansion of Antonio Vasconcelos, a man whose fortune had grown in proportion to his ego. Located in Guarujá, his beachfront property was known as the venue for exclusive events that brought together Brazil's intellectual elite. At 58, Antonio maintained the proud bearing and penetrating gaze that intimidated even his closest associates. He was not just a successful businessman in the publishing industry. He was a man who considered himself a guardian of intelligence, an appreciator of brilliant minds. On that sunny Saturday morning, Antonio was watching the ocean from his balcony while sipping a strong coffee. Beside him, Marcelo Barreto, his personal assistant for more than a decade, was waiting for instructions with a tablet in his hands. "Has everyone confirmed their presence, Marcelo?" asked Antonio, without taking his eyes off the horizon. "Yes, sir, the 20 guests confirmed, including Dr. Cecilia Almeida." Antonio smiled discreetly when he heard that name. Cecilia Almeida, a renowned linguist from USP, specialized in Brazilian indigenous languages. Her presence at the event was essential to the plan he had meticulously devised. "Excellent. And is everything prepared as I requested?" "Yes, sir. Professor Teixeira sent the text in Nhengatu this morning. It is kept in his safe as ordered." Antonio nodded, satisfied. Nhengatu, also known as the General Amazonian language, was an indigenous language that few Brazilians mastered, despite being a fundamental part of the country's linguistic history. The choice of that language for his challenge had not been random. It was perfect for testing the true intellectual capacity of his guests. "The Brazilian Linguistics Symposium will be remembered for years, Marcelo, not as another boring academic event, but as the moment when I separated the true intellectuals from the mere scholars of facade." Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, in a small rented apartment on the beach, Cecilia Almeida was finishing packing her suitcase. At 45 years old, her face bore the marks of a life dedicated to studies and long expeditions through the interior of Brazil. Her brown hair, now with a few grey strands, was tied up in a messy bun, and her green eyes reflected a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Antonio Vasconcelos's invitation had come unexpectedly. It had been almost 20 years since she had had contact with him. 20 years since that expedition to the Amazon that had changed the course of their lives. The reunion promised to awaken memories that she had tried so hard to bury. "Does he still hold a grudge?" she muttered to herself as she closed her suitcase. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Rodrigo Santos, his former student and current colleague in the linguistics department. "Teacher, are you ready for the event of the century?" Rodrigo's cheerful voice tried to hide his nervousness. "I'll be by to pick you up in 15 minutes. "I'm almost ready, Rodrigo. But I confess that I have a strange feeling about this symposium." "What do you mean? It's an honor to be invited. Antonio Vasconcelos rarely opens the doors of his mansion, and they say that his library has very rare works on indigenous languages." Cecilia sighed. "I've known Antonio longer than you think. He doesn't do anything without a hidden agenda. This symposium, I'm sure there's something more to it." What Rodrigo didn't know, and few in academia knew, was that Cecilia and Antonio had been more than colleagues in the past. The expedition that had brought them together had also painfully separated them when conflicting views on the preservation of indigenous languages created a rift between them. For Antonio, languages were curiosities to be studied and catalogued. For Cecilia, they were living manifestations of cultures that deserved to be preserved and respected. When Rodrigo arrived, he found Cecilia in front of an old wooden box looking at yellowed photographs. "Are they from your time in the field?" Rodrigo asked, curious. "Yes, from the expedition to the Upper Rio Negro in 2004. She showed a photo of herself and a younger Antonio, both smiling, surrounded by members of an indigenous community. "That's when I met Antonio. We were so idealistic. Back then, I never imagined you knew him so well. People change, Rodrigo. Power and money transform. She put the photos away and closed the box carefully. Come on, I don't want to be late. During the journey to the mansion, Cecilia remained silent, observing the coastal landscape. Her mind was divided between academic curiosity about the symposium and apprehension about meeting Antonio again. What did he intend with that event? Why invite her after so many years of silence? As the car approached the imposing gates of the estate, Cecilia felt butterflies in her stomach. The place was even more impressive than she had imagined. A Mediterranean-style mansion with a privileged view of the sea, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. Wow, this is amazing, Rodrigo exclaimed as they walked through the gates after identifying themselves to security. Impressive, yes, but remember, Rodrigo, not all that glitters is gold. Cecilia nervously adjusted the necklace she was wearing, a small pendant with indigenous symbols, a gift from an elder during that fateful expedition. When they got out of the car, they were greeted by Marcelo, who led them along the stone path to the main entrance. Other guests were already arriving, all well-known figures in Brazilian academia. Dr. Almeida, welcome. Mr. Vasconcelos is looking forward to meeting you again. Marcelo's tone suggested he knew more than he let on. As they entered the large, main hall decorated with rare indigenous artifacts and priceless paintings, Cecilia immediately felt the weight of a gaze upon her. At the top of the central staircase, like a king surveying his subjects, stood Antonio Vasconcelos. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, time seemed to rewind 2 decades. Cecilia, he said, slowly descending the steps, long time no see. The tone of his voice was friendly, but his eyes hid something that only she could recognize, a challenge. And Cecilia realized in that instant that the true purpose of the symposium was about to reveal itself. The main hall of Antonio Vasconcelos' mansion shone under the light of crystal chandeliers, reflecting on the anxious faces of the 20 selected guests. University professors, renowned researchers and prestigious linguists formed small groups, exchanging theories about the true purpose of this unusual meeting. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and elaborate canapes, while soft instrumental music filled the room. Cecilia remained motionless for a few seconds, absorbing the impact of her reunion with Antonio. He had aged well, with grey hair at his temples that gave him an even more authoritative air. His posture remained impeccable, and his tailored suit showed that his years of financial success had been generous. "I see time has been kind to you," Antonio said, approaching with measured steps. "You still wear that necklace, I notice." Cecilia instinctively touched the Indian pendant around her neck. "Some things have value that money can't buy, Antonio. Something you seem to have forgotten." His smile faltered for a moment, but soon returned even wider. "Always direct, isn't she? One of the qualities I admired most in you." He turned to Rodrigo, extending his hand. "And you must be Rodrigo Santos. I read your article on the dialectal variations of Ngatu. Promising, although a bit idealistic." Rodrigo, visibly intimidated by his host's presence, shook his hand with excessive firmness. "It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Vasconcelos. Your collection on indigenous languages is legendary in academic circles. Please call me Antonio. And yes, my collection is a source of pride. Perhaps I can show it to you later." He turned back to Cecilia. "As for you, I'm sure you'll be especially interested in some items I've recently acquired." Before Cecilia could respond, an elegant woman in her 50s approached the group. Dressed in sophistication, her shrewd eyes assessed Cecilia from top to bottom. "So this is the famous Dr. Almeida," she said, extending her hand with perfectly manicured nails. "I'm Helena Vasconcelos. Antonio talks a lot about your work." "Helena has been my wife for 12 years, Antonio explained, placing his hand possessively on her waist. "She personally oversaw all the preparations for this weekend." Cecilia felt an unexpected pang, which she quickly attributed to surprise. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Helena. The mansion is stunning." Thank you, Antonio has demanding tastes in everything. Helena's smile didn't reach her eyes. I hope you enjoy your stay. The tension in the air was palpable, and Rodrigo gave Cecilia a confused look, but she kept her composure. At that moment, Marcelo appeared next to Antonio, whispering something in his ear. Ah, it seems all the guests have arrived, Antonio announced, his voice easily carrying over the side conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my humble retreat. Please accompany me to the conference hall, where I will explain the true purpose of this gathering. The guests followed Antonio down a hallway decorated with indigenous ritual masks and ancient maps of Brazil. Cecilia couldn't help but notice that many of the exhibits were of inestimable cultural value and had probably been acquired through questionable means. The thought made her deeply uncomfortable. The conference hall turned out to be an impressive circular library with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with rare books and manuscripts. In the center, chairs had been arranged in a semicircle before a small makeshift stage. On a mahogany table sat a wooden box carved with indigenous motifs. As the guests took their seats, Cecilia looked around at the faces. She recognized Professor Luciana Mendes, an expert in Tupi phonology, Dr. Paulo Freitas, a respected ethnolinguist, and even the controversial Professor Mauricio Esteves, known for his controversial theories on the preservation of endangered languages. They all seemed equally curious and apprehensive. My distinguished colleagues, Antonio began, positioning himself at the center of the stage with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention. You are surely wondering why I have gathered the greatest experts on Brazilian indigenous languages in my home. He paused theatrically, looking directly at Cecilia before continuing. We are here for a challenge, a test that will separate the true masters from the mere scholars. For years I have observed how the field of indigenous linguistics has become an environment of empty theories and little practical application. How many of you truly master the languages you study? How many could survive in a community using only the language you claim to know so well? Murmurs of indignation ran through the room. Professor Esteves stood up, visibly irritated. That's an insult, Vasconcelos. We didn't come all this way to have our credentials questioned by someone who abandoned field research 2 decades ago. Antonio smiled, unperturbed. It's not an insult, Esteves. It's an invitation to prove your worth. He walked over to the wooden box and opened it slowly. Inside this box is a text in Nyengatu. Not just any text, but one that holds deep meanings for those capable of truly understanding it. He took out a carefully preserved scroll and held it with almost religious reverence. The challenge is simple. Translate this text by the end of the weekend. The winner will receive not only recognition, but also— He paused again dramatically. Exclusive access to Father Anchieta's original manuscripts on the general language, which I recently acquired from a private European collector. The revelation caused a stir among those present. Such manuscripts had been considered lost for centuries and would represent an invaluable treasure for any researcher in the field. That's impossible, protested Professor Mendes. These manuscripts belong in a public collection, not a private one. The law and I have different interpretations of the proper disposition of historical artifacts, Professor, Antonio replied with a cold smile. But we are not here to discuss the ethics of acquisitions. We are here for an intellectual challenge. Cecilia watched the situation with growing discomfort. This was more than just an academic competition. It was a demonstration of power and manipulation. Something in Antonio's behavior suggested a hidden agenda, especially in the frequent glances he cast in her direction. The necessary resources are available at the library, Antonio continued. Dictionaries, grammar books, and even internet access, although I doubt Google Translate will help you this time. He laughed at his own joke, joined only by Helena and a few more eager-to-please guests. Now, allow me to serve dinner before you begin. The official competition begins tomorrow at 8 a.m. You will have until Sunday at 6 p.m. to submit your translations. As the guests headed to the dining room, Rodrigo approached Cecilia, visibly disturbed. Professor, this is crazy. He's treating academic knowledge like a reality show game. Cecilia nodded thoughtfully. Antonio has always had a performative view of intelligence, Rodrigo. For him, knowledge is not something to be shared, but displayed, like a trophy. Are you going to participate? Do I have a choice? Those manuscripts, if authentic, are too important to be in his hands. During dinner, served at a long oak table overlooking the sunlit garden, Cecilia noticed how Antonio was constantly watching her. Between dishes of Brazilian haute cuisine, sophisticated reinterpretations of moquecas, bobos and other classics, he told stories of his acquisitions around the world, always emphasizing the astronomical values and exclusivity of his collection. Helena, sitting to her right, seemed more interested in gauging the guests' reactions than participating in the conversation. When her eyes met Cecilia's, there was something more than simple jealousy. There was curiosity, and surprisingly a kind of recognition. After dessert, while the guests dispersed around the room for drinks, Helena approached Cecilia, who was observing a Tucano ritual mask displayed as if it were mere decoration. "He never forgot you, you know," Helena said without preamble, her voice low and controlled. "Even after all these years." Cecilia turned around, surprised by his frankness. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. This whole event is about you somehow. I know my husband well enough to recognize when he's obsessed." Helena took a sip of her drink. "The Nhengatu." Text wasn't chosen at random. He spent months searching for exactly the right words. Before Cecilia could respond, Antonio materialized beside them, as if he had noticed their private conversation. "I hope you're getting to know each other better," he said, his tone falsely jovial. "Helena is a great admirer of indigenous cultures. Isn't that right, my dear?" "Only what I can use as decoration," Helena replied with a sharp smile. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check that the guest rooms are properly prepared." When Helena walked away, Antonio turned to Cecilia, his expression changing to something more intimate, almost vulnerable. "We need to talk in private," he said. "There's something you need to know before the challenge begins tomorrow." "I already know your games, Antonio." "No, Cecilia. This time the game is much more serious than you imagine." His eyes shone with an unsettling intensity. "And believe me, you'll want to hear what I have to say." Dawn on the coast of São Paulo brought with it a soft mist that enveloped Antonio. Vasconcelos's mansion, giving the place an almost mystical aura. Cecilia had slept little. The private conversation that Antonio had promised never happened. He had been conveniently called by Marcelo to resolve an urgent problem with one of the guests, and when he returned, it was already too late for private conversations. Now, as she watched the sea from the window of her luxurious room, Cecilia tried to decipher the true purpose of that meeting. Helena's words echoed in her mind. The text in Nhengatu was not chosen at random. What secret could those words hide? And why had Antonio insisted so much on her presence? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Rodrigo, already prepared for the day of challenges, carrying a folder with notes about Nhengatu. "Did you sleep well, teacher?" he asked, noticing the dark circles under her eyes that Cecilia was trying to hide. "Not really. There's something about this house that makes me uneasy." She adjusted her Indian necklace, a gesture that had become almost a nervous tic since her arrival. "Rodrigo, I want you to promise me something. No matter what happens this weekend, keep your emotional distance from this competition. Don't let Antonio turn your passion for linguistics into something toxic." The young researcher nodded, although his gaze revealed that the promise would be difficult to fulfill. Academic ambition and the opportunity to access rare manuscripts were powerful temptations. At 8 o'clock sharp, all 20 guests were gathered in the circular library. Individual tables had been set up around the room, each equipped with paper, pens, basic Nhengatu dictionaries, and a tablet with limited internet access, only for consulting academic resources, as Antonio made a point of explaining. The host, dressed in an impeccable suit despite the early hour, stood in the center of the circle. Beside him, Marcelo held a silver tray with 20 sealed envelopes. "Good morning, distinguished colleagues," Antonio began, his voice echoing in the perfect acoustics of the hall. "I hope you have rested well. For the challenge that awaits, you will require not only technical knowledge, but also linguistic and cultural sensitivity." He gestured and Marcelo began handing out envelopes. Inside these envelopes is the text in Nyengatu that I mentioned yesterday. You will notice that it is not a simple text, but a complex narrative that incorporates dialectal nuances specific to the Upper Rio Negro region. Cecilia looked at her envelope with apprehension. The red wax seal bore a symbol she recognized immediately. It was the same symbol engraved on her necklace, representing an important constellation in the cosmology of the Rio Negro people. "Do not open the envelopes until I give you my command," Antonio continued. "First, I want to establish a few rules. This is not a school test with constant supervision. You are respected adults and professionals. You are welcome to consult the resources available, exchange ideas if you wish, and even go outside to get some fresh air in the garden. The only restriction is that you are not to leave the property until the end of the challenge on Sunday." He looked directly at Cecilia as he added, "The best translation will not necessarily be the most literal, but the one that captures the cultural and emotional essence of the text. Remember, indigenous languages are not just codes to be deciphered, but expressions of unique worldviews." It was almost ironic to hear him say that, Cecilia thought. Those were words she herself had used during their heated discussions on the expedition 20 years ago, words he had ridiculed as academic sentimentality. "Now you may open your envelopes. The official challenge begins now." The sound of 20 envelopes being opened simultaneously filled the room. Cecilia carefully removed the parchment, immediately noticing the quality of the material. It was handmade paper made from natural fibers, following traditional techniques. The text was handwritten, in a precise script that she recognized as Antonio's own. The first few lines made her heart race. "Yepe ara pisa ipiranga upe, amana usasara me." A story that began, one day on the banks of the Red River after the rain had stopped. It wasn't just any story. It was that story, the one they had heard from an elder Barre during the expedition, sitting around a campfire, the night she and Antonio had first become close. His eyes quickly scanned the rest of the text. Yes, it was the same narrative, with slight variations, but indisputably the story of the warrior who followed the path of the stars to find his great love again. The story that had become a kind of private code between them during those intense months in the Amazon. Looking around, she noticed that the other participants were already completely absorbed in their translations, some frantically consulting dictionaries, others typing on the tablet. Only she seemed paralyzed by the revelation. When her gaze met Antonio's, who was observing everyone from a corner of the room, he raised his eyebrows slightly in silent challenge. "Are you okay, teacher?" whispered Rodrigo, sitting at the next table. "You look like you saw a ghost." "In mind and ear, away I did," she replied, composing herself. "But don't worry, let's get to work." The following hours passed in silence, broken only by the turning of pages and the drumming of fingers on tablet keyboards. Cecilia worked meticulously, but her mind was divided between the technical translation and the memories that the text evoked. She remembered that night in the Amazon vividly. The humid heat, the smell of smoke from the campfire mixed with the aroma of the forest, the stars shining in the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Elder Barre, with his weather-beaten face, narrating the story with broad gestures, and Antonio at his side, translating in real time for her, still inexperienced in the language. Later that night, they had walked along the riverbank, discussing the beauty of the story. That was when he had kissed her for the first time, under the same starry sky that guided the warrior in the story. "I'll find you in any constellation," he had said, pointing to the stars that formed the symbol she now wore around her neck. Around noon, Marcelo announced that lunch would be served on the terrace. Participants could take a break, but were advised not to discuss their translations during the meal. "How's it going?" Rodrigo asked as they walked to the terrace. "I'm having trouble with some idioms. I think they're dialectal variations that don't appear in standard dictionaries. It's a complex text, Cecilia agreed evasively. Antonio deliberately chose a narrative with layers of cultural meaning. On the terrace, a light but sophisticated meal was served. Dishes that combined Amazonian ingredients with haute cuisine techniques, pirarucu with tucupi sauce, pupunha palm hearts, native fruits in elegant presentations. Antonio was absent, but Helena circulated among the guests like a perfect hostess, although her smile never seemed sincere. "How are you finding our little challenge, Dr. Almeida?" Helena asked, approaching Cecilia with 2 glasses of white wine, offering one to her. "Interesting," Cecilia replied, accepting the glass. "Your husband has a talent for creating provocative situations." Helena laughed, a clear sound that didn't match the intensity of her gaze. "Teasing is his specialty. Sometimes I wonder if he does it for pleasure or for some deeper psychological need." She took a sip of wine. "You know, after you declined his initial invitation, he became obsessed with securing your presence. He even rewrote the text in Ngatu 3 times until he was satisfied." Cecilia almost choked on her wine. "Did I decline the invitation?" "Oh." Helena looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't know? Marcelo sent out a preliminary invitation 3 months ago, and his assistant replied that you were on field." Her assignment and couldn't attend. Antonio was furious. He cancelled the original event and rescheduled it specifically for when he knew you would be available. Before Cecilia could fully process this information, Professor Esteves approached, visibly irritated. "This is nonsense. The text is full of deliberate linguistic traps, expressions that do not exist in standard Ngatu, impossible syntactic constructions." "Perhaps it is not the Ngatu you know, Professor," Cecilia replied calmly. "There are significant dialectal variations among communities, especially in the Upper Rio Negro. And—" "How can you be so sure?" he challenged, his face red with indignation. "Because I was there," he replied simply. "I lived with these communities. I learned directly from them, not just from books and grammars." The professor walked away, muttering something about academic arrogance, while Helena watched the scene with evident interest. "Impressive," she commented. "Antonio said you had exceptional knowledge, but he didn't mention your confidence." When they returned to the library to continue the challenge, Cecilia found Antonio waiting for her at the door, as if he knew exactly when she would arrive. "Are you having trouble with the text?" he asked, with a smile that suggested he already knew the answer. "None I can't overcome," she replied, holding his gaze. "But I imagine you know that. After all, you chose this particular narrative for a reason, didn't you?" "All texts have layers, Cecilia. Some are visible, only to those who shared their creation." He stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "The Cabinet of Curiosities at 10 o'clock. Come alone. There is something I need to show you." "Why should I trust you, after all?" His smile faded, revealing a more vulnerable expression she hadn't seen in decades. "Because some constellations never change position, no matter how much time passes." And with that he walked away, leaving her with the feeling that the real challenge of that weekend had nothing to do with translating a text in Ngatu, but with deciphering the intentions of a man who had marked her life in ways she had never been able to completely erase. The afternoon passed slowly, with the participants increasingly absorbed in their translations. The silence in the library was broken only by the occasional sigh of frustration or the sound of pages being turned impatiently. Cecilia, however, worked with a concentration that hid her inner turmoil. Her hands moved precisely over the paper, but her mind was divided between the present and the past, between the text and the meeting scheduled for that evening. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Marcelo announced dinner. This time Antonio joined the guests, although he sat at the opposite end of the table from Cecilia. Throughout the meal, he remained engaged in seemingly unpretentious conversations with other researchers, but Cecilia could feel his gaze occasionally, falling on her. Helena, on the other hand, sat strategically next to Cecilia, as if she wanted to continue the conversation that started during lunch. "Are you progressing well with the translation?" Helena asked, pouring herself a glass of red wine. "Yes, thank you," Cecilia replied with studied politeness. Your husband has chosen a fascinating text. Helena smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Antonio has a talent for identifying hidden treasures. That's how he found me, after all, in an art gallery in Paris where I was just an assistant curator with big ambitions. She paused, watching Cecilia's reaction. Just like he found you in the Amazon. He told me, about the brilliant linguist who accompanied him on that fateful expedition. Cecilia kept her expression neutral, although she felt her heart race. I didn't know he was talking about me. Oh, not often. Just enough for me to know that you were significant. Helena leaned forward slightly. I must confess that I have been curious for years about who this woman was, who left such a profound mark. Now that I have met her, I begin to understand. There's not much to understand, Helena. It was a long time ago. We were different people. Really? Helena raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. Antonio may have accumulated wealth and power, but at his core he's still the same man obsessed with deciphering and possessing what he considers valuable. And you? She studied Cecilia with shrewd eyes. You still carry the same fire, only more controlled. The conversation was interrupted when Rodrigo joined them, visibly excited about his progress in the translation. Professor, I think I've identified a pattern in the dialectal variations. There is a consistent internal logic that, perhaps, it would be best if we did not discuss our work during dinner, Cecilia suggested gently, casting a meaningful glance in Helena's direction. The young researcher blushed. Of course, I'm sorry, I'm just excited. This challenge is, he searched for the right word, transformative. Helena smiled. Academic passion, so touching. She stood gracefully. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on dessert. When Helena walked away, Rodrigo leaned over to Cecilia. There's something strange going on. Professor Esteves is furious, saying the text is impossible to translate correctly. And Dr. Mendes is convinced there's some kind of hidden code between the lines. And you, Rodrigo, what do you think? I think it's an extraordinary test. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. His eyes shone with excitement. I'm learning more this weekend than I did in an entire semester at university. Cecilia smiled, touched by the young man's idealism. Just remember what we talked about. Keep your emotional distance. After dinner, the guests dispersed. Some returned to the library to continue working. Others preferred the comfort of their rooms. Cecilia retired to her room, claiming to be tired, but in reality she needed time to prepare for her meeting with Antonio. At 10:05, she quietly left her room. The cabinet of curiosities was in the west wing of the mansion, a place Antonio had mentioned during the initial tour, but which remained closed to guests. Walking down the hallway, lit only by soft sconces, Cecilia felt the weight of anticipation growing with each step. The office was a double door of dark wood, carved with motifs that mixed Art Nouveau and indigenous symbols, a combination that perfectly represented Antonio's duality between the sophisticated and the primitive, the European and the Brazilian. She knocked softly. The door opened immediately, as if he had been waiting on the other side. Antonio had changed from his formal suit to a white linen shirt and dark pants, a look that made him look younger, closer to the man she had met in the Amazon. Come in, he said simply, stepping aside. The cabinet of curiosities was an impressive octagonal room with illuminated display cases displaying rare indigenous artifacts, ceremonial headdresses, Marajoara ceramics, musical instruments, ritual weapons. In the center of the room, a round table of fine wood displayed an old map of Brazil, protected by glass. The walls not occupied by display cases were lined with shelves of rare books and, surprisingly, photographs. Photographs from the expedition 20 years ago. Cecilia slowly approached one of the walls, her gaze captured by the images she had not seen in so long. There they were, young and full of ideals, surrounded by the exuberance of the Amazon rainforest and the members of the Baré community that had welcomed them. In one of the photos, she and Antonio were smiling side by side, with the river in the background and the setting sun creating a golden halo around them. You kept all these photos, she murmured, her voice thick with restrained emotion. I kept everything, Cecilia. Antonio approached, stopping at a respectful distance. Every memory, every word, every promise. She turned to face him, crossing her arms defensively. Why did you bring me here, Antonio? What do you want from me? After all this time, he took a deep breath before answering. Redemption. Redemption. His voice sounded more vulnerable than she ever remembered hearing it. I know you won't believe it, but this entire event, this challenge, is my way of righting a wrong from the past. What mistake would that be? Abandoning our joint work? Commercializing traditional knowledge to enrich yourself? Turning sacred artifacts into decorative items for your mansion? Cecilia couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. All of those, yes, but mostly... He walked over to one of the display cases and pressed a hidden button. The case slid aside, revealing a safe built into the wall. With precise movements, he punched in a combination and opened the metal door. This. He removed from the safe a worn leather book that Cecilia recognized immediately. It was the field journal they had kept together during the expedition, in which they had documented not only scientific observations, but also the stories and traditions shared by the Barre elders. You've kept it all this time, she whispered, reaching out her hands instinctively. I didn't just keep it, I based my entire career on it. Antonio handed the diary to her reverently. The articles I've published, the books I've written, the lectures I've given, everything came from here, from our work together. Cecilia leafed through the diary with trembling fingers, recognizing her own handwriting interspersed with Antonio's. Pages and pages of meticulous observations, translations, linguistic analyses. You published all this without giving me credit, she said, old hurt resurfacing. You turned our work into your own personal glory. Yes. He didn't try to deny it. And it was the biggest mistake of my life. Antonio walked to a side table and poured 2 glasses of wine from an already opened bottle. He offered one to Cecilia before continuing. When we came back from that expedition, I was blinded by ambition. I saw the academic potential, the doors that knowledge would open, the prestige it would bring. You wanted to take the ethical path, consult the community, share the results with them, make sure they benefited in some way. He shook his head. I didn't have the patience for that. So he just moved on alone, she added, without looking back. I've looked back more times than you know, he confessed, his gaze meeting hers. But pride kept me from admitting you were right. And so one success led to another, one opportunity to another, and soon I was trapped in the persona I had created. Cecilia took a sip of wine, trying to process what she was hearing. Part of her wanted to believe his sincerity, while another remained deeply skeptical. Why now, Antonio? Why this elaborate scheme to bring me here and confess your sins? He hesitated, as if carefully measuring his next words. Because I'm sick, Cecilia, a heart condition that the doctors say has no cure. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. I have a year at most. The revelation hit Cecilia like a physical blow. She looked at Antonio with new eyes, noticing, for the first time, the subtle signs she had ignored, the slight pallor beneath his tan, the weariness disguised by his impeccable posture, the way he occasionally raised a hand to his chest in a barely perceptible gesture. I'm sorry, she said finally, and she meant it. I don't want your pity, he replied quickly. I want your cooperation, one last time. He walked to another display case and took out a package wrapped in raw cotton cloth. The Anchieta manuscripts are real. I acquired them 6 months ago from a monastery in Portugal through channels I'd rather not detail. He carefully unwrapped the package, revealing yellowed sheets protected by preservation wrappers. They're authentic, and they're revolutionary, to our understanding of the evolution of the general tongue, but I don't want them locked away in my private collection after my time is up. What are you proposing? A joint publication. You and I documenting and analyzing these manuscripts, giving appropriate credit to the indigenous communities whose knowledge formed the basis of the general language. a work that would be both a scholarly contribution and a form of redemption. Cecilia placed her glass on the table, needing both hands free to examine the manuscripts Antonio now offered her. They were, without a doubt, extraordinary. Father Anchieta's meticulous notes on the grammatical structures, vocabulary, and idiomatic expressions of the language he had helped systematize in the 16th century. "Why the challenge then?" she asked, looking up from the precious documents. "Why this elaborate competition?" Antonio smiled wistfully. "Partly for show," he shrugged. "Old habits die hard. I needed to keep up appearances in front of others, but mostly—" He stepped closer, almost touching her arm before stepping back. "I needed to see if you were still the same. If you still had the same passion for knowledge, the same respect for languages as living cultural expressions, not just objects of study." And the text in Hingatu, the story of the warrior and the stars, a memory and a test. "I wanted to see if you remembered." His eyes searched hers. "If it still meant anything to you." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions, shared memories, and divergent paths. Cecilia felt the weight of 2 decades of resentment begin to lift, replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginnings of understanding. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is a lot to process." "In one night," Antonio nodded, not pressing. "Of course. But there's something else you should see before you decide." He walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a folder of documents. "These are reports on the current state of the Baré communities we work with. For the past 5 years, I've been anonymously funding language and cultural preservation projects in the region through a foundation." He handed the folder to Cecilia, who opened it with growing curiosity. Inside were detailed reports, photographs of community schools, cultural centers, bilingual publications, all supported by the Fundação Estrelas do Rio, a name that directly referenced the story they had shared. "Why anonymously?" she asked, leafing through the documents with growing admiration. "Because I didn't deserve recognition," he replied simply. "It was the least I could do after exploiting your knowledge for so long." Before Cecilia could respond, they heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Antonio quickly collected the manuscripts and returned them to the safe. The door opened, without warning, and Helena walked in, her gaze assessing the scene with clinical precision. "So this is where you are," she said, her tone deceptively light. "I hope I'm not interrupting an academic meeting." "I was just showing Dr. Almeida some items from my private collection," Antonio replied with studied naturalness. "Material relevant to tomorrow's challenge." Helena smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How generous of you to offer advantages to a specific competitor." "It's not an advantage," Cecilia interjected, maintaining her composure. "It's a historical context that will eventually be shared with all participants." "Of course," Helena approached, her high heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "My husband has always been an advocate for equal opportunity." She touched Antonio's arm appropriately. "The guests have been asking for you, dear. Some of them have questions about the format of the final presentation." "I'll be there in a moment," he replied, his tone soft but firm. Helena leaned over and kissed her cheek, a gesture that seemed more like a marking of territory than a show of affection. Before leaving, she gave Cecilia one last look. "Don't stay too late, Dr. Almeida. Tomorrow will be a challenging day for everyone." When the door closed again, Antonio sighed. "I apologize for that." "There's no need," Cecilia replied, composing herself. "Your wife has every right to be concerned about your private meetings. Helena and I have a complicated marriage," he said evasively. "Based on mutual interests, more than—" He trailed off. "You don't owe me any explanations about your personal life, Antonio." Cecilia walked toward the door. "I need to process everything you've shown me. We'll talk more tomorrow." He nodded, respecting her decision. "Just one thing before you go." His voice made her pause with her hand on the doorknob. "The translation of the text, the true translation, Only you can complete it correctly. There are meanings that only the two of us understand." Cecilia looked at him one last time before leaving. "Maybe that's the real problem, Antonio. There have always been meanings that only the two of us understood, and that has isolated us from the others, each in our own way." As she walked back to her room, Cecilia felt the weight of the field diary that Antonio had insisted she take with her. 20 years of shared history, of divergent paths, and now the possibility of an academic and perhaps personal reunion. The revelation about Antonio's illness had shaken her certainties, as had the glimpse of the projects he was anonymously funding. Was he truly seeking redemption, or was this just another one of his elaborate games? And, more importantly, was she ready to reopen that door she had closed so long ago? Sunday morning arrived with overcast skies that promised rain, a fitting contrast to the tense atmosphere that permeated the mansion. Cecilia had spent much of the early morning rereading her field journal, delving into memories that had lain dormant for 2 decades. The detailed notes, the linguistic sketches, the oral history transcripts, all of it brought back the intensity of those months in the Amazon, when she and Antonio had shared not only academic discoveries, but also dreams and vulnerabilities. When he finally fell asleep, close to dawn, his dreams were populated by images of the river, the forest, and the starry sky that had inspired the narrative now at the center of the challenge. When Cecilia came down for breakfast, she found the other participants in varying states of anxiety and exhaustion. Professor Esteves looked as if he had aged 10 years overnight, with dark circles under his eyes and trembling hands that could barely hold his coffee cup. Dr. Mendez maintained a calm facade, but the nervous movement of her fingers drumming on the table revealed her inner turmoil. As for Rodrigo, his initial enthusiasm had been replaced by an almost feverish intensity. "Professor," he called when he saw her enter, "I have made significant progress in the translation. There are elements in the narrative that seem to connect with the cosmologies of several Amazonian peoples, not just the Barre. It is fascinating how—" "Rodrigo," Cecilia interrupted gently, "remember our agreement not to discuss our translations during meals." The young researcher blushed. "Of course, I'm sorry, I'm just—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Obsessed, I suppose. I've never worked with such a complex and revealing text." Cecilia nodded understandingly. "Academic obsession is a double-edged sword, Rodrigo. It can lead us to extraordinary discoveries, but it can also blind us to the bigger picture." As she helped herself to fruit and strong coffee, Cecilia noticed the absence of both Antonio and Helena. Marcelo circulated among the guests with his usual efficiency, but he seemed more tense than usual, constantly checking his phone. After breakfast, participants returned to the library for the final hours of the challenge. The deadline was 6 p.m., when everyone had to submit their translations and orally present their interpretations of the most challenging aspects of the text. Cecilia sat at her desk, contemplating the pages of notes and translations she had produced. Unlike the others, she was not struggling with the technicalities of the language, but rather with its emotional and ethical implications. The Nhengatu text was not just a traditional story. It was a code between her and Antonio, a personal message disguised as an academic challenge. Around noon, while the participants worked in silence, the library door opened and Helena entered. Her usually controlled face showed signs of disturbance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice betraying a slight tremor, "I apologize for the interruption. Mr. Vasconcelos had a health setback this morning and is resting under medical advice. The challenge is continuing as planned, and he looks forward to joining everyone for the final presentation." A murmur of concern ran through the room. Cecilia felt a tightness in her chest, remembering the previous night's revelation about Antonio's heart condition. "Is it serious?" asked Dr. Mendez, expressing general concern. "Nothing to worry about," Helena replied with a forced smile. "Just a medical precaution. Get on with your work." When Helena left, Cecilia waited a few minutes before discreetly getting up and heading towards the door. "Teacher?" Rodrigo called, confused. "Where are you going?" "I need to check something." "In my room," she replied. "I'll be right back." In the hallway, Cecilia hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. She didn't know the entire layout of the mansion and didn't know where Antonio's quarters were. That's when she saw Marcello emerging from a side hallway, carrying a tray of medicine. "Marcello," she called softly. The assistant stopped, visibly surprised. "Dr. Almeida, shouldn't you be in the library?" "How is he?" he asked directly, ignoring the question. Marcello looked around before answering. "Stable now. The doctor just left. It was a mild episode." "I need to see him." "That would not be appropriate, doctor. Mrs. Vasconcelos was very clear about—" "Marcello," Cecilia interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "I've worked with you and Antonio longer than Helena. I know about your condition. He told me last night." The assistant looked momentarily disconcerted, then his shoulders relaxed in resignation. "Follow me. But be brief, please. I don't want to create any more tension in the house." He led her down a different hallway, to a wing that seemed more private. They stopped in front of a pair of dark wooden double doors. "I'll let her in, but if he's asleep—" "I won't disturb you," Cecilia promised. Marcello knocked softly before opening the door. "Sir, Dr. Almeida is here." "Let her in," came the faint reply from inside the room. The room was spacious and elegant, decorated in deep blues and dark wood. Large windows offered views of the ocean, though the curtains were partially drawn, creating a cozy, dim light. Antonio reclined on a chaise longue near the window, wearing a silk robe over his pajamas. He looked pale and tired, but his eyes came alive when he saw Cecilia. "Leave us, Marcello," he instructed. When the assistant left, closing the door, Antonio gestured to a nearby chair. "I didn't expect to see you here. The challenge can wait," she replied, sitting down. "What happened?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Same as always. Chest pain, shortness of breath. Nothing medication can't temporarily control." "Does Helena know about your condition?" "You know I'm sick. You don't know how much time I have left." He smiled weakly. "It would be inconvenient for your plans to redecorate the East Wing." Cecilia didn't smile back. "This isn't something to joke about, Antonio. Grim humor has always been my defense mechanism." He adjusted himself in the chaise, a slight grimace of pain crossing his face. "But that's not why you're here, I imagine." "I read the diary," she said directly. "I spent the night reliving those months in the Amazon. And I understand better now what happened between us. How two idealists with different views on knowledge followed such different paths." Antonio nodded slowly. "You wanted to protect, preserve, give back. I wanted to display, publish, gain recognition." "Both approaches had their value," Cecilia admitted, surprising him. "My academic purism also had its flaws. By refusing to publish findings without what I considered perfect ethical protocols, I may have deprived the world of important knowledge. And by commercially exploiting what we learned, ignoring the rights of the communities, I betrayed their trust, and yours." He looked at her directly. "We're too old not to admit our mistakes, don't you think?" A comfortable silence settled between them, as if 2 decades of resentment began to dissipate, replaced by a mature understanding of human complexities. "About your proposal," Cecilia said finally, "Anchieta's manuscripts." "Yes?" There was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I'm interested, but there are conditions." She sat up straighter. "First, any publication must include explicit credit to the indigenous communities whose knowledge formed the basis of the lingua geral. Second, a significant portion of the profits must go toward language preservation projects in the affected communities." "I agree to both conditions," he replied promptly. "In fact, I had already planned something similar." "And third," she continued, "we need to expand the project, not just publish and analyze the manuscripts, but create a center for documentation and language revitalization, a space where researchers and community members can work together on equal terms." Antonio looked surprised. "That's ambitious. You have the financial resources, I have the academic network, and the trust of the communities. Together, we could create something truly transformative." She leaned forward. "This isn't just about personal redemption, Antonio. It's about historical reparations and cultural justice." He was silent for a moment, considering the proposal. "I've always admired your vision, Cecilia. Even when we disagreed," he held out his hand. "We have a deal." She accepted his handshake, feeling the historic weight of the moment. "There is one more thing," she added. "Today's challenge—" "Ah, yes." A mischievous smile appeared on his tired face. "Do you have any questions about the translation?" "None about the technical translation, but there is one passage in particular that intrigues me." She pulled her notes from her pocket. "The part where the warrior says, 'Asui rese amaite, inde arese yaso panumante.' Literally, it would be something like, 'Because of this I think of you, so we go together.' And what is your doubt?" "It's not a linguistic issue. It's about intent." She looked at him directly. "That sentence wasn't in the original version of the story we heard from Elder Barret. You added it." Antonio nodded slowly. "Perceptive, as always." "Why?" "Because it sums up what I've been trying to tell you since you arrived. Because of the past we shared, I think of you. That's why we should move forward together now." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Not just on this project, but— Have you signed up yet? Do it now and tell us which city you're following us from." The door opened abruptly, interrupting the moment. Helena entered, her gaze quickly shifting from Antonio to Cecilia. "Forgive me," she said, her cold tone belying her apology. "I didn't realize you had visitors, dear. The doctor was specific about the need for rest." "I'm resting, Helena," Antonio replied calmly. "Dr. Almeida came to discuss a technical aspect of the challenge." "Of course." Helena crossed her arms. "Such a technical aspect that needed to be discussed in your room, not in the library with the other participants." Cecilia stood up, maintaining her dignity. "I was just leaving. Thank you for the clarification, Antonio. It will be useful for my presentation." She walked towards the door, but Helena didn't move to let her through. "You know, Dr. Almeida," Helena said, her voice as soft as velvet but sharp as a blade, "I've always wondered what kind of woman would leave such a deep mark on a man like Antonio. I imagined someone extraordinary, almost mythical." She tilted her head slightly. "It's interesting how reality rarely matches legend." "Helena." Antonio's voice had a warning tone. "Don't worry, dear, just sharing an academic observation with your colleague." Helena finally stepped aside. "The guests are asking about lunch. Should I inform them that it will be served in 30 minutes? "Yes, please," Antonio replied, the weariness evident in his voice. As Cecilia was about to leave, he called her. "Cecilia, about that phrase, 'Yaso panhumante.' Think about it." Helena watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, but said nothing. In the hallway, Cecilia paused to regain her composure. The meeting had been intense on multiple levels. The confirmation of Antonio's illness, the agreement on the joint project, the veiled message in the translation, and, no less important, Helena's barely concealed hostility. "Dr. Almeida." She turned to find Rodrigo walking quickly towards her, looking agitated. "Rodrigo, you should be working on your translation." "I'm worried, Professor. Something strange is happening." He looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "Professor Esteves is convinced that the text is a fraud, an artificial creation that mixes dialects in an impossible way. He is planning to denounce Mr. Vasconcelos during the final presentation." "Based on what?" "He claims to have identified syntactic patterns that would be impossible in any natural variant of Niingatu. He is convinced that it is a trap to humiliate the participants." Cecilia sighed. Esteves had always been a brilliant academic, but rigid in his convictions. "The text is authentic in its essence, Rodrigo, but you are right to see that there are personalized elements." "What do you mean?" "It means this challenge is about more than linguistics. It's about deep, cultural understanding, about picking up on nuances that don't show up in formal grammars." She put her hand on the young man's shoulder. "Keep up the work. Trust your academic intuition, not just the rules." As they walked back to the library, Cecilia pondered how the afternoon would unfold. The linguistic challenge had turned into something much more complex, an interweaving of academic ambitions, personal rivalries, and, at the center of it all, a story of love and redemption encoded in a language few fully understood. The translation she had prepared overnight was not only technically accurate, but it carried an answer to Antonio's veiled request. If he was truly seeking a new beginning, a chance to right the wrongs of the past, she was willing to consider it, not out of romantic nostalgia, but for the opportunity to create something meaningful that honored the communities whose voices had been silenced for so long. As she resumed her seat in the library, under the curious gaze of the other participants, Cecilia opened her notebook to the final page of her translation and added one last line. Yaso panhumante. We will continue together, but this time on the right path. At 5 o'clock, with only an hour left before the deadline, the library of the Vasconcelos mansion was abuzz with nervous activity. Some participants were frantically revising their translations, others were mentally rehearsing their oral presentations. Professor Esteves, in particular, was exhibiting an agitated demeanor, alternating between consulting dictionaries and furiously scribbling notes in his notebook. Cecilia, on the other hand, maintained a calm that contrasted with the general anxiety. Her translation was complete, not only linguistically but also emotionally. She had decided to accept Antonio's challenge on all levels, academic, ethical, and personal. "How can you be so calm?" whispered Rodrigo, sitting at the adjacent table. His young face showed signs of exhaustion, with deep circles under his eyes and hair disheveled from running his hands through it so much. "Years of fieldwork have taught me that some translations cannot be rushed," she replied with a gentle smile. "Sometimes you have to let the words breathe, find their own way to us." Rodrigo seemed about to ask another question when Marcelo entered the library, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "Mr. Vasconcelos apologizes, but due to his indisposition, he will be unable to be present during the presentations. Mrs. Vasconcelos will conduct the session in his place. Please finish your translations. In exactly 45 minutes, everyone will be required to report to the main hall." A murmur of disappointment ran through the room. For many, the absence of the host diminished the prestige of the event, making it just another academic presentation rather than an opportunity to impress an influential figure in the field. "This changes everything," Professor Esteves muttered loudly enough to be heard. "Without the great master to judge our efforts, what's the point?" "The purpose is knowledge, Professor," Cecilia replied calmly. Regardless of who is watching, Esteves gave him an acidic look. "Easy for you to say, Almeida. We all know that you and Vasconcelos have a history. This entire event was orchestrated to highlight it somehow." Before Cecilia could respond, Dr. Mendez intervened. "That is inappropriate, Esteves. Dr. Almeida built her reputation through decades of serious work. To insinuate favoritism is, at the very least, disrespectful." "We'll see who's right when we present our translations," Esteves retorted, turning back to his papers. The final. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning and pens scratching paper. At exactly 5:45 p.m., Marcelo returned to escort them to the main hall. The space had been transformed. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle in front of a small makeshift stage, where a table and a microphone awaited the presenters. In the first row, a more elaborate armchair, almost a throne, was empty, presumably reserved for Helena. The participants took their places, nervously organizing their notes. Cecilia noticed how some avoided looking at their colleagues' work, fearing they would find evidence that their own translations were mistaken. At 6 p.m. sharp, Helena entered the ballroom. Her look was impeccable, a navy blue silk dress that perfectly complemented the room's decor, discreet but visibly expensive jewelry, and meticulously arranged hair and makeup. She took her place in the central armchair with the studied grace of a queen accustomed to power. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her melodious voice filling the room effortlessly. "As you know, my husband is indisposed and has asked me to represent him on this important occasion. While I am not a linguistics expert like yourselves, I have enough appreciation for knowledge to recognize excellence when I see it. His gaze swept over the faces of the participants, stopping momentarily on Cecilia before continuing. The presentations will be in alphabetical order by last name. Each person will have 10 minutes to present their translation and explain the challenges they faced. At the end, I will announce the winner according to the criteria established by my husband. She consulted a list on her lap. Our first presenter will be Dr. Augusto Alves. One by one, the participants took the stage. Some presented technical and accurate translations, but they lacked cultural depth. Others lost themselves in elaborate etymological analyses that, while academically impressive, failed to capture the narrative essence of the text. Professor Esteves, when his turn came, used half his time to argue that the text was a linguistic farce, a patchwork of incompatible dialects designed to confuse and humiliate the participants. This so-called challenge is nothing more than a display of intellectual arrogance, he concluded, his face red with indignation, an attempt by Vasconcelos to prove that only he truly understands these languages, while we mere academic mortals stumble in the darkness. Helena listened to everything with an impassive expression, occasionally taking discreet notes. When Sibi Ivan Rodrigo was called, Cecilia noticed that the young researcher was trembling slightly. However, as soon as he began to speak, his passion for the subject overcame his nervousness. The text we have been presented with is not just a narrative, he explained, growing in confidence with every word. It is a window into a specific worldview, where the divisions between the physical and the spiritual, the human and the natural, are much more fluid than in our Western conception. His translation, though containing some technical errors, demonstrated impressive cultural sensitivity for someone of his age and limited experience. When he finished, he received a nod of approval from Cecilia, which made him smile shyly. Finally, it was her turn. As she stepped onto the stage, Cecilia felt all eyes on her, some curious, some envious, some downright hostile. Helena watched her with particular intensity, her shrewd eyes not missing a single movement. "Good evening," Cecilia began, her voice calm but designed to reach every corner of the room. "The text we have been given is undoubtedly a significant linguistic challenge. However, its greatest complexity lies not in its syntax or vocabulary, but in the layers of cultural and emotional meaning it carries." She opened her notebook, but she didn't really need to consult it. She knew her translation by heart. The narrative tells the story of a warrior who, separated from his great love by tragic circumstances, undertakes a journey following a star map. It is not just a love story, but a metaphor for the search for knowledge, for deep understanding that transcends linguistic and cultural barriers. As she presented her translation, she noticed a slight movement at the back of the room. Antonio had entered silently, leaning on a cane that had not been there this morning. His face seemed paler than before, but his eyes were alive, fixed on her with an almost palpable intensity. The warrior says, "Asui rese amaiteinde, arese yaso panhumante." "Because of this I think of you, that is why we will continue together," Cecilia continued, looking directly at Antonio. This phrase is particularly significant because it represents the moment when the protagonist realizes that his journey is not a solitary one, that true knowledge cannot be achieved or possessed individually, but must be shared, built in community. Helena followed the direction of Cecilia's gaze and turned, noticing her husband's presence. Her expression hardened momentarily before returning to the mask of cordiality. "Unlike some interpretations we hear today," Cecilia continued, "I do not see this text as a linguistic hoax, but as a brilliant example of how indigenous languages preserve knowledge that goes beyond the limitations of our Western academic categories. Yes, there are elements that defy standard grammars, but that does not make them wrong. It just reminds us that living languages resist the rigidity of our classifications." She closed her notebook with a gentle gesture. "My complete translation is here, but the most important thing is not the words on the paper. It is the commitment to honor not just the text, but the cultural context from which it emerges. Indigenous. Languages are not relics of the past to be studied with academic detachment, but living expressions of ancestral knowledge that have much to teach us in the present. A deep silence followed his words. It was broken by the sound of applause. Antonio had begun to applaud, slowly at first, then more vigorously. Others joined in hesitantly, until a wave of applause filled the hall. Only Professor Esteves and Helena remained. Impassive. When Cecilia returned to her seat, Rodrigo leaned over to whisper, "That was amazing, Professor. I've never heard a presentation that connected the technical and cultural aspects so well." "Thank you, Rodrigo. But the real connection goes beyond linguistics," she replied enigmatically. Helena stood up, demanding the room's attention. "I thank everyone for their presentations. Before I announce the winner, my husband would like to share a few words." Her tone was polite, but her eyes revealed irritation. Antonio walked slowly to the center of the room, leaning on his cane. Up close, it was obvious that the effort was costing him considerably, but he maintained his posture erect and his gaze steady. "First, I apologize for my absence for most of the day. Health circumstances." He gestured vaguely. "But I'm deeply gratified by the level of commitment everyone has demonstrated." His eyes met Esteves's. "Even those who questioned the legitimacy of the challenge contributed to our collective understanding. Doubt is an essential part of the academic process." He paused, as if gathering his strength. This symposium was conceived not just as a competition, but as an invitation to reflect on how we approach indigenous linguistic knowledge. For decades, we have studied these languages as objects, as academic curiosities, without fully recognizing their value as living expressions of rich and complex cultures. His gaze swept over the faces of those present before continuing. "Today I have heard technically impressive translations and methodologically rigorous analyses, but I have also heard something rarer and more valuable. The understanding that translation is not just about transferring words from one code to another, but about building bridges between worldviews." Helena watched her husband with an enigmatic expression, a mixture of reluctant admiration and distrust. "The winner of this challenge," Antonio continued, "is not necessarily whoever produced the most accurate translation by conventional academic standards, but whoever demonstrated the cultural and ethical sensitivity necessary to honor the spirit of the original text." He paused again, this time longer, his eyes fixed on Cecilia. "And so I am announcing not just a winner, but a paradigm shift. The Anchieta manuscripts will not be a prize to be possessed individually, but the core of a new center for documentation and linguistic revitalization, where researchers and members of indigenous communities will work in equal partnership." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Helena raised her eyebrows, clearly not having been informed of this change of plans. "This center will be co-led by Dr. Cecilia Almeida, whose presentation today exemplified exactly the kind of approach we need, and by representatives of the communities whose languages will be documented and revitalized." Cecilia's surprise was genuine. Although they had discussed the concept of a center during their private conversation, she had not expected such an immediate and definitive public announcement. "Antonio," Helena interjected, her voice controlled but with a note of tension, "perhaps we should discuss the details of this project in a more private setting before making any announcements." "The details, yes," he agreed calmly, "but the fundamental principle that knowledge should not be hoarded but shared, that is not open to negotiation." He turned back to the audience. "For those interested in participating in this project, there will be opportunities. For those who prefer more traditional approaches, I respect your choice. But the era of the isolated academic in his ivory tower, studying indigenous languages without direct engagement with their speakers, is ending." Professor Esteves stood up, his face a mask of indignation. "This is absurd. You invite renowned experts to a supposed academic challenge, only to turn it into a stage for your cultural charity project?" Antonio smiled, unwavering. "It's not charity, Professor. It's justice, and recognition of a historical debt we owe to the people whose knowledge we have exploited for centuries." Esteves looked around for support, but found mostly expressions of thoughtfulness or open enthusiasm for the proposal. Defeated, he gathered his papers and strode out of the room. "This symposium is officially over," Antonio announced. "But the real work is just beginning. I thank everyone for participating and hope that you take away not only linguistic knowledge, but a new perspective on what it means to truly understand a language." As the attendees stood, some forming excited groups to discuss the surprising announcement, others approaching Antonio to express interest in the project, Helena walked directly to Cecilia. "Impressive maneuver, Dr. Almeida," she said, her voice low but intense. "In one weekend you have accomplished what I have failed to do in 12 years of marriage: inspire Antonio to share his precious knowledge." "That wasn't my goal," Cecilia replied calmly. "I genuinely believe in the project." "Of course you do," Helena smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But know that I'm not just the decorative wife you imagine. I have my own interests in this mansion, and the fortune that supports it. I never presumed to know your interests, Helena." "Well, perhaps we should have a private conversation about them before you and Antonio get too far ahead with your joint plans." Helena adjusted a diamond bracelet on her wrist. "I think we have more in common than you realize." Before Cecilia could respond, Rodrigo approached, his face alight with youthful enthusiasm. "Professor, this is extraordinary. A documentation and revitalization center. It's exactly the kind of project I've always dreamed of." Helena walked away with one last meaningful look, leaving Cecilia torn between Rodrigo's infectious excitement and the uneasiness caused by Helena's enigmatic words. Across the room, Antonio watched the interaction, his expression a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The linguistic challenge was over, but it was clear that a more complex and personal competition was just beginning, one that would involve not just translations of ancient texts, but the interpretation of human intentions, perhaps the most challenging of all languages to decipher. The morning after the symposium brought a different kind of light to Guarujá. The rain that had threatened all Sunday finally fell during the early hours of the morning, washing away the dust and leaving the air with that crystal-clear quality that only exists after a storm. Most of the guests had already left, returning to their universities and research institutes, with mixed impressions of the unusual event. Cecilia, however, had remained. Sitting on the balcony of her room, she watched the rough sea as she sipped a cup of strong coffee. The last 24 hours had been an emotional roller coaster, from the tension of the challenge to the surprise of Antonio's public announcement, culminating in her strange conversation with Helena. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," she called, assuming it was Rodrigo, who had also decided to stay an extra day to discuss possible contributions to the new center. To his surprise, it was Helena who entered, impeccably dressed in a white linen ensemble that contrasted with her perfect tan. Without the artifice of the previous night's elaborate jewelry and formal makeup, she looked almost vulnerable, but her eyes held the same calculating intensity. "Good morning, Dr. Almeida. I hope I'm not interrupting your morning contemplation." "Not at all," Cecilia replied, indicating the empty chair next to her. "And please call me Cecilia." Helena accepted the invitation, sitting down with the studied grace of someone accustomed to being observed. For a moment they both remained silent, enjoying the view. "Antonio told me about his condition," Helena said finally, surprising Cecilia with her frankness, "about how much longer the doctors say he has." "I'm sorry," Cecilia replied sincerely. "It must be difficult. More for him than for me, I'm afraid." Helena gazed into the distance with a distant expression. "Our marriage was always more of a strategic partnership than a romance. I brought European refinement and art world connections. He brought money and academic prestige." She shrugged with studied elegance. "It worked well for 12 years. Cecilia didn't know how to respond to this unexpected confession, so she waited for Helena to continue. "The talk I promised yesterday," the other woman continued, turning to face her directly, "about our common interests. I'm listening. Antonio has always been an obsessed man, with rare languages, with indigenous artifacts, with his own reputation." Helena crossed her legs, adjusting her posture. And for a time with you. Even though he never mentioned your name explicitly, your shadow hovered over our marriage like a persistent ghost. I didn't mean to. I'm not blaming you, Helena interrupted with an elegant gesture. I'm just setting the context. Seeing you two together this weekend confirmed what I've always suspected. Whatever happened between you 20 years ago was never truly resolved. Cecilia remained silent, uncertain about where this conversation was going. The documentation center that Antonio announced is a noble project. Genuinely admirable. Helena smiled, a smile that for the first time seemed to reach her eyes, and surprisingly aligned with my own interests, like this. Before I met Antonio, I was an assistant curator specializing in contemporary indigenous art. My passion has always been to bridge the gap between ancestral traditions and modern artistic expressions. She paused, as if weighing her next words. The work you and Antonio plan to do with languages could be expanded to include traditional artistic expressions, not as museum artifacts, but as living traditions that continue to evolve. Cecilia's surprise must have been evident, for Helena laughed softly. You were expecting the jealous villain, weren't you? The possessive wife determined to sabotage her dying husband's plans with his former lover. She shook her head. I'm more pragmatic than that. Antonio has a year at most. What we do with that time is more important than old romantic rivalries. Cecilia studied Helena's face, looking for signs of manipulation or deceit, but found only their surprising frankness. I'm proposing an alliance, Cecilia. You bring the linguistic expertise and academic credibility. Antonio brings the funding and institutional contacts. I bring my expertise in contemporary indigenous art and my contacts in the international gallery world. Helena bowed slightly. Together we can transform this center into something truly revolutionary, a space where language, art, and traditional knowledge are not only preserved, but celebrated and revitalized. Why tell me this now? Why not during the symposium? Because I needed to see how you would react to Antonio's announcement. Whether you were interested only in academic glory, or whether you truly shared his vision for a broader project. Helena smiled again. Your reaction convinced me that perhaps we have more in common than our connections to the same man. Before Cecilia could respond, another knock sounded on the door and Rodrigo entered after a brief "excuse me." He stopped when he saw Helena, clearly surprised by her presence. Sorry, I didn't know you were in a meeting. Don't worry, Rodrigo, Cecilia said. Mrs. Vasconcelos was just sharing some fascinating ideas about the new center. Oh? The young researcher looked intrigued. I've been thinking about this a lot too. In fact, I spent half the night making notes on possible structures and methodologies. Helena rose gracefully. Your enthusiasm is admirable, Mr. Santos. I believe your youthful profile and energy will be valuable to the project. She turned to Cecilia. Antonio is expecting us in the library in half an hour. He has some important documents to show us about the financing of the center. After Helena left, Rodrigo looked at Cecilia with a confused expression. What just happened? Last night she seemed to want to murder you with her eyes, and today they are planning the future together. Cecilia smiled. Life is rarely as simple as it first appears, Rodrigo. People are complex, with layers that are not always evident at first. Like the text in Hingatu, he observed perceptively. Exactly like the text. Half an hour later, Cecilia and Rodrigo entered the library where they found Antonio and Helena in an apparently friendly conversation. Antonio seemed more rested than the day before, although he was still using his cane. On the large central table, several documents were spread out in an organized manner. Ah, you're here, Antonio said, his face lighting up when he saw Cecilia. Helena told me about your conversation. I must admit, it surprised me. Me too, Cecilia replied with a cautious smile. But it's exactly the kind of unexpected collaboration this project needs. He gestured toward the documents. I've spent the morning structuring the legal and financial aspects of the center. I want to make sure everything is solidly in place before—" He trailed off, but there was no need to. "The Estrelas do Rio Foundation will be expanded," Helena explained, naturally assuming the role of facilitator. "Instead of just funding existing projects, it will be the sponsor of the Center for Documentation and Linguistic and Artistic Revitalization of Brazilian indigenous peoples." "Long name," commented Rodrigo. "We will work on it," Helena smiled. "The important thing is that the legal structure is already in place and the initial resources are secured through an endowment fund that Antonio has established." "The most important thing," Antonio intervened, "is that the management will be shared. A board of directors made up of academics, artists, and, crucially, representatives of the indigenous communities whose languages and traditions will be the focus of the work." Cecilia approached the table, examining the documents with growing admiration. The level of detail was impressive, from the organizational structure to budget estimates for the first 5 years, including salaries for indigenous researchers and scholarships for young people from the communities. "That's extraordinary," she murmured. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Antonio replied with a melancholy smile. "The most important part still needs to be defined, the academic and cultural vision that will guide the work. And that's where you come in, Cecilia. And where Mr. Santos can make a significant contribution," Helena added, surprising Rodrigo. "His enthusiasm and familiarity with technologies that can help with digital documentation are exactly what we need." Over the next few hours, the four worked tirelessly, outlining visions, methodologies, and priorities for the center. What initially seemed like an unlikely alliance between figures with such different backgrounds and motivations turned out to be surprisingly harmonious. Each brought unique perspectives that complemented one another in unexpected ways. Late in the afternoon, when Marcelo came in to announce that dinner would be served soon, he found the group excitedly gathered around a map of Brazil where they were marking potential partner communities. "We need to start with the Upper Rio Negro," insisted Cecilia, "not only because of the linguistic richness of the region, but to honor the origin of this project." "I agree," Antonio said, "and I suggest that our first official expedition take place within 3 months, enough time to establish the basics, infrastructure, but not so long that—" Again, he left the sentence incomplete. 3 months is ambitious, Helena noted, but doable if we mobilize the right resources. She made some notes on her tablet. "I can start making contacts with cultural institutions interested in sponsoring traveling exhibitions on indigenous languages and arts. That would help give visibility to the project. And I can develop a digital platform for collaborative documentation," Rodrigo offered enthusiastically, "something that allows community members to contribute directly using smartphones or tablets." Antonio watched the interaction with an expression of satisfaction that went beyond the project itself. For him, there was something deeply gratifying in seeing people with such different perspectives united by a common purpose, especially Cecilia and Helena, whose unlikely alliance represented a form of personal redemption he had hardly dared hope for. Over dinner, served on the veranda overlooking the now calm ocean after the storm, conversation flowed naturally between professional and personal topics. Helena revealed herself to be surprisingly knowledgeable about the artistic traditions of the Amazonian peoples, sharing stories of exhibitions she had curated in Paris and Madrid. Rodrigo, initially intimidated by the luxurious surroundings and illustrious company, gradually relaxed, contributing innovative ideas about how new technologies could support language preservation. As the night wore on and the stars appeared in the clear sky, Antonio finally addressed the topic that had been silently hanging over them. "There's something I need to formalize," he said, his voice more solemn. "Given my prognosis, I want to make sure the project continues regardless of what happens to me." A respectful silence fell over the table. "The documents I prepared today include a clause establishing Cecilia as the center's academic director and Helena as artistic and cultural director." He looked at them both. with equal powers and autonomy to make decisions in their respective areas of expertise. Antonio, Cecilia began, excited. It's the right decision, he interrupted gently. You both bring exactly what the project needs. And Rodrigo, he turned to the young man, I'd like to offer you the position of Technology and Innovation Coordinator. Your vision for how technology can serve cultural preservation is exactly what we need. Rodrigo seemed speechless, his eyes shining with emotion. Joyce Tomás, it would be an honor, sir. Excellent. Antonio raised his wine glass. A toast, then, to the Center for Documentation and Revitalization, or whatever they decide to call it eventually. May it be a space where past and future converse, where ancient traditions find contemporary expression, and where no language or knowledge is lost through neglect or indifference. They toasted, each silently reflecting on the path that had brought them here and what lay ahead. Later, when Helena and Rodrigo had retired, Cecilia and Antonio remained on the balcony, contemplating the ocean under the moonlight. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and possibilities. I never imagined this weekend would end like this, Cecilia confessed. When I received your invitation, I thought it would be just another academic competition to boost your ego. Antonio laughed softly, a reasonable assumption given our history. And Helena, she completely surprised me. She has that effect on people. He glanced in the direction his wife had departed. Our marriage has never been conventional, but there is a genuine mutual respect. She understands what this project means to me, and to you. Cecilia studied his profile against the starry sky. The text in Hingatu, the story of the warrior following the stars to find his love. Why did you choose that particular narrative? Because it symbolizes everything this project represents. A journey guided by ancient constellations, crossing boundaries between worlds, seeking reconnection. He turned to face her, and because it was the first story we translated together, that night by the river. Yaso panhumante, she murmured. We will go on together. Yes, but this time in the right way. He smiled as he recognized the words she had added to his translation. Not just you and me, but everyone who shares this vision. Helena, Rodrigo, the indigenous communities, future researchers and artists. A constellation of collaborators, suggested Cecilia. Exactly. Antonio looked up at the sky. You know, when I got the diagnosis, my first thought was about all the things I would leave unfinished, all the unstudied manuscripts, the undocumented languages, the knowledge that would be lost. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. But now I see that the legacy isn't in the things we own or the papers we publish. It's in the connections we make, the bridges we build. Cecilia placed her hand over his, a simple gesture of human solidarity that transcended her complicated past. The center will be this legacy, Antonio, a space where languages and cultures that have been silenced for centuries can find new voices. And where old adversaries can become allies, he added with a wistful smile. Not adversaries, Cecilia corrected. Just people who have temporarily lost the ability to properly translate each other's feelings. The next morning brought the concrete beginning of the project. While Marcelo coordinated the logistics for transporting Anchieta's manuscripts to a safe location in Sao Paulo, Cecilia, Helena, and Rodrigo worked in the library, transforming ideas into detailed action plans. A week later, the quartet traveled to São Paulo to present the project to the university and potential institutional partners. The reception was enthusiastic, especially when Antonio publicly announced that all indigenous artifacts from his private collection would be donated to the center, with consultations with the communities of origin to determine which should be returned and which could be used in educational exhibits. 3 months later, as planned, the center's first official expedition set off for the Upper Rio Negro. Antonio, despite his increasingly fragile health, insisted on participating. It was an emotional and symbolic journey, a return to the place where it all began 2 decades earlier. In the Baré community that had welcomed them in the past, now transformed but still maintaining its essential traditions, Antonio and Cecilia were recognized by some of the elders they had met on their first expedition. The welcome was warm, especially when they explained the purpose of the new center and the commitment that the documented knowledge would remain the cultural property of the communities. On one particular evening, sitting around a campfire under the same starry sky that had inspired the narrative of the challenge, the circle seemed complete. Helena chatted animatedly with local artisans about possible collaborative exhibitions. Rodrigo documented traditional chants with state-of-the-art equipment, working side by side with young people from the community. And Antonio and Cecilia, sitting side by side, watched with quiet satisfaction as something tangible began to emerge that would transcend their individual lives. "It was worth it," Antonio murmured, his voice weak but calm. "All the way here." Cecilia nodded, her eyes reflecting the glow of the stars and the fire. "Yaso panhumante," she replied, pointing to the sky where the constellation that symbolized their shared journey shone brightly. "We will continue together, on the right path." And so it was. The center flourished in the years that followed, becoming an international model of collaboration between academia and traditional communities. Antonio did not live to see the full fruits of his transformed legacy, but he was privileged to witness its vibrant and promising beginnings. Helena and Cecilia, initially united only by their connection to Antonio, developed a surprisingly effective professional partnership and eventually a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to cultural preservation. Rodrigo grew professionally within the project, eventually leading a technology team that developed innovative methods of digital linguistic documentation. The translation challenge that had brought together a diverse group of scholars that weekend in Guarujá has blossomed into something much larger, a movement to ensure that ancient languages and knowledge not only survive, but flourish in the contemporary world. A living testament to the fact that when diverse perspectives come together around a common purpose, true translation, the kind that goes beyond words to connect cultures and hearts, becomes possible. And it all began with a phrase in Nhingatu, a story about following the stars, and the courage of two former lovers to redefine the meaning of legacy and redemption. The more you comment and share, the more we can bring you stories that touch your heart. Leave your name in the comments, and we may include you in one of our next stories with a special greeting just for you.